I've been married to Helen for 23 years, and for 23 years, I told myself her family just needed time to warm up to me. They never did. I should have known that the first Christmas I spent at her parents' house in Barrie. Her mother Lorraine smiled at me the way you smile at someone standing in the wrong checkout line. Politely, waiting for me to figure it out and move. My name is Bruce. I'm 61 years old now. I spent 32 years as a structural engineer, the last 12 running my own firm out of Mississauga. We had 17 employees at our peak. We built schools, community centers, a couple of bridges outside Sudbury that are still standing and will be standing long after I'm gone. I say that not to brag. I say it because it matters later. Helen's family never asked what I did. Not once in 23 years did her brother Owen sit across from me and ask a single genuine question about my work or my life. When I talked about a project, he'd nod the way you nod at a child explaining a drawing. Then he'd pivot to whatever he wanted to talk about. And Helen would let him. That's the part I keep coming back to, even now. Not what Owen did. Not what Lorraine did. What Helen did, which was nothing, every single time. I want to be fair here, because I've spent a lot of hours in the past 2 years trying to understand this as honestly as I can. Helen wasn't cruel. She wasn't some cartoon villain. She loved me in her way. But she had grown up in a family where her mother's approval was the weather. It determined the temperature of every room, every gathering, every relationship inside that house. And Helen, even at 54 years old, even after raising 2 kids and building a life of her own, was still checking that forecast every single day. Her mother ran the family the way some people run a small business. Tightly, with a clear org chart, and I was always, without exception, somewhere near the bottom of it. The reunion was Owen's idea. He always has big ideas. He'd suggest these elaborate family weekends, renting a cottage up near Huntsville, everyone pitching in, and somehow the pitching in was never quite equal. Helen and I ended up covering most of the food and supplies. Owen would show up with 2 cases of Creamore and a bag of chips, and talk all weekend like he'd personally funded the whole thing. This particular summer weekend was at a rented property on Lake of Bays. 6 bedrooms, a dock, a fire pit. It was genuinely beautiful. We drove up Friday afternoon. Helen, our son Patrick, who was 26 at the time, and me. Owen was already there with his wife Tanya and their 2 teenagers. Lorraine had come up with Helen's aunt, a few cousins. 12 people total. I remember pulling into the gravel driveway and feeling good. I actually felt good. The drive up through Muskoka in July, windows down, Patrick asleep in the back seat. I thought, this is going to be fine. We've done this before. It's going to be fine. I should have turned around at the driveway. Within an hour of arriving, I could feel it. The specific chill. The way Lorraine hugged Helen for a long time at the door and then turned to me and said, Bruce, the way you'd say the name of a recurring expense you hadn't figured out how to eliminate yet. Owen came around the side of the house with a beer in his hand and did that thing where he shook my hand without quite looking at me. It was fine. I unpacked. I helped carry in the groceries, 3 trips because I'd bought enough to feed everyone for the weekend. Nobody commented on that. Of course they didn't. Saturday was actually fine, mostly. We took the canoes out. Patrick and I paddled around the north end of the lake for a couple hours, and it was the best part of the whole trip, honestly. Just him and me and the water and the trees and not having to perform anything for anyone. We came back for lunch, and that's when it started. Owen was telling some story about a renovation he was doing on his place in Oakville. Redoing the back deck, new fence line, the whole thing. He was telling it like it was major surgery, the complexity, the cost, the contractors who kept letting him down. I listened. I actually had some useful things to say. I'd done structural assessments on residential properties. I knew deck load requirements. I knew what to watch for with post foundations in clay soil, which Oakville has a lot of. I waited for a pause and offered a couple of thoughts. Owen looked at me for a moment. Then he said, Yeah, I'm not really going for the engineering angle. I just want it to look good. A few people laughed, small laughs. The kind that say, Yes, we noticed, and we're going along with it. I didn't say anything. I picked up my sandwich and took a bite. Helen didn't say anything either. I want to be very precise about what happened next, because the precision matters. Lorraine, from across the picnic table, said, not quietly, Owen, I think Bruce was just trying to help. She said it in the tone of someone managing a situation, not defending a person. Like I was a thing to be managed, not a man to be backed up. Like even her version of defending me had to be packaged as a comment about Owen's manners rather than a statement about my worth. And Owen said, "I know, Mom, I'm just saying." And that was it. I looked at Helen. She was looking at her plate. That evening, sitting around the fire, Owen started talking about finances. He'd had a few drinks by then. He got expansive when he drank, louder, more entitled, funnier to himself. He was talking about the housing market, about property values, about how he'd been smart about certain investments. The unspoken part, as always, was the comparison. Owen had done well, managed a regional distribution chain for a hardware company. Good salary, solid pension. He talked about it the way some men talk about their golf handicap. I'd built something from nothing. My firm. 17 people. Payroll, insurance, liability, everything. I'd carried that weight for 12 years. I wasn't going to talk about it around a fire with people who had already decided what I was. But Patrick was sitting next to me, and I could see him getting tense. He's a good kid. He's always been protective of me in a way that made me proud and sad at the same time. Proud because it meant he saw me clearly, sad because it meant he'd also seen what I'd put up with. Owen said something. I don't remember the exact words now. Something about how it must be nice to have a steady paycheck without the stress of running a real business. He was talking to someone else. Theoretically. But he glanced at me when he said it. Patrick started to say something. I put my hand on his arm. Let it go, I said quietly. He did. But I saw his jaw tighten. Later that night, after most people had gone inside, Helen found me down at the dock. I was sitting with my feet over the edge looking at the water. She sat down next to me and said she was sorry about dinner. She said Owen had been drinking. She said Lorraine had tried to smooth things over. I said, Helen, this happens every time. She said, I know. But it's not worth making it into a bigger thing. I turned and looked at her. 23 years. And that was still her answer. Don't make it a bigger thing. When is it going to be worth it? I said. What's the number? How many times before you say something? She didn't answer. We sat there for another few minutes. Then she went inside. I sat on that dock for a long time. The loons were out. The water was perfectly still. It's a beautiful country, this part of Ontario. I've always loved it. I thought about my father, who had come over from Scotland in 1971 with $40 and a trade certificate, and spent 30 years installing heating systems in office buildings in Toronto. He wasn't a man who complained about how he was treated. He just kept going. I used to think that was strength. That night on the dock, I started wondering if it was something else. Sunday morning was the last morning. Breakfast was big. I'd brought bacon, eggs, the works. I cooked most of it. People ate. Nobody said much. It was one of those post-fire pit mornings where everyone's slightly tired and the weekend is winding down. Owen came in late, poured himself a coffee, sat down. He looked at the food on the table and said, without any particular meanness, Bruce, you're like the family butler. He said it with a grin, waiting for the laugh. The laugh came. Some of it. Tanya smiled at her phone. One of the cousins did a kind of surprise snort thing. Lorraine said, Owen, in that management tone again. And Helen laughed. It was short, barely there, but it was there. I put down the spatula. I didn't say anything. I walked to the back of the kitchen and stood at the window, looking out at the dock for about 30 seconds. Then I turned around and walked back and started cleaning up the dishes. Patrick had seen it. He got up and helped me without a word. After breakfast, Lorraine pulled me aside, actually pulled me by the arm, which she had never done before, and said that she thought I should apologize to Owen for creating tension at the table. I stood there and let that sentence land. I want to be very clear. I had said nothing at the table. I had put down a spatula and looked out a window for 30 seconds. That was my crime. Lorraine, I said, I didn't say anything. You made the room uncomfortable, she said. You have a way of doing that. Owen was just joking. You made everyone feel bad. I made everyone feel bad, I said. I think an apology would help the weekend end on a good note. I looked at her. She was completely serious. She had run this family for 50 years on this exact system. Manage the discomfort, smooth the surface, keep the org chart intact. I was a recurring expense, And the most efficient solution was to get me to devalue myself. "Where's Helen?" I said. Lorraine told me Helen agreed with her. I walked outside. I found Helen in the bedroom we'd been sharing, folding her clothes to pack. I said, "Your mother wants me to apologize to Owen." Helen said, "I think it would help." I said, "For what, Helen?" "I cooked breakfast. He called me the family butler." You laughed. "And your mother wants me to apologize." Helen said, "It was a joke. And you did make the room uncomfortable after." I looked at my wife. The woman I'd shared a life with for 23 years. The woman I'd worked 60-hour weeks for. The woman who had never once, in all those years, turned to her brother and said, "Don't talk to my husband that way." I said, "Okay." Then I went and packed my bag. I want to explain what okay meant, because it wasn't agreement. It was conclusion. I'd spent 23 years trying to find the threshold, the moment where it would be worth it to Helen to stand beside me. And standing in that bedroom, watching her fold a sweater, I understood finally and completely that there was no threshold. There wasn't going to be a moment. This was the marriage. This had always been the marriage. I zipped up my bag. I picked up my phone and called Patrick's cell. He was outside. I said, "Can you drive yourself back? I need to leave separately." He said, "Dad, what happened?" I said, "I'll call you tonight." "Can you drive yourself?" He said yes. He asked again what happened. I told him I'd explain later. I told him I was fine, which was true in a strange way I couldn't articulate yet. I carried my bag out to the car. I didn't say goodbye to Owen. I didn't say goodbye to Lorraine. I stopped briefly in the kitchen where Tanya was loading the dishwasher and said, "Thank you for the weekend." She looked up, surprised. That was it. I drove out of the driveway and turned south toward the highway. 3 hours back to Mississauga. I spent the first hour just driving. Radio off. Windows up. The weight of 23 years sitting in the passenger seat. Somewhere past Bracebridge, I pulled into a Tim Hortons and sat in the parking lot for a while. I called my lawyer, Elaine. We had an existing professional relationship. She'd done contract work for the firm. I told her I needed to start a conversation about separation. She was quiet for a moment and then said, "Okay, come in Monday." I drove the rest of the way home. I want to be honest about the next part, because it wasn't clean or triumphant. It was just quiet and heavy and very, very sad. I got back to the house, our house, the house in Mississauga we'd had for 16 years, and I walked through it slowly. The kitchen where I'd made Sunday dinners for 20 years. The hallway where Patrick and his sister Meg's school photos still ran up the wall like a timeline. The backyard where I'd built a proper deck when we first moved in, done it right. Posts sunk 4 feet with proper concrete footing, because I knew what clay soil does over time. I sat in the kitchen until it got dark. Helen called at 7:30. She was still at the cottage. She said, "You just left." I said, "Yes," she said, without saying anything to anyone. I said goodbye to Tanya. She was quiet. Then she said, "Are you going to apologize to Owen when we get back?" I said, "No." Another silence. She said, "Then what are we doing, Bruce?" I said, "Helen, I called Elaine today." Long silence. "Our Elaine?" "Yes," she said. "You called our family lawyer because you didn't want to apologize to Owen." I said, "No. I called her because I've been putting my bag down and staying for 23 years, and I'm not doing it anymore." She started crying. I want to acknowledge that. It wasn't a manipulation. She was genuinely hurt and shocked. That matters. She hadn't understood, truly, that we had been arriving at this point for decades. She thought it was about Owen. She thought it was about that morning. She couldn't see that I'd been carrying a bag I'd wanted to put down for years. We talked for a long time that night. It was the most honest conversation we'd had in probably 15 years. But it was also, I understood clearly, too late. You can't have the real conversation after the conclusion. The conversation doesn't undo the conclusion, it just explains it. The separation was civil, if not easy. Elaine helped structure it. Helen got the house. I didn't fight her on it. We split the financials fairly. I took my business assets and moved into a rental in Port Credit, a one-bedroom with a view of the lake, which I'd never have chosen for myself before, but which turned out to suit exactly who I was becoming. Patrick called me the day after the cottage. I told him everything. He was quiet for most of it, and then he said, "Dad, I've watched this for a long time." He said it gently, not as an accusation to anyone, just as a fact. He'd watched it. He'd seen it, and he'd watched me stay, over and over, because that's what I'd decided staying meant. Meg was harder. She loves her mother and she loves her grandmother, and she needed time to understand that I hadn't left to hurt anyone. I hadn't left as a statement. I'd left because I finally believed, really believed, in my chest and not just my head, that I was worth more than what that room had offered me for 23 years. It took Meg about 8 months to get there with me. We're good now, better than good. Owen called me once, about 6 weeks later. I don't know what he expected. He started with, "I just want to clear the air," which is a sentence that has never once in human history preceded an actual clearing of the air. He talked for a while. He used the words context and miscommunication several times. He didn't say sorry. When there was a pause, I said, "Owen, I appreciate the call." Then I wished him well and hung up. Lorraine never called. That told me everything I needed to know, and nothing I didn't already. Here's the thing about building structures for a living. You spend a lot of time thinking about load. What a thing can carry. What it's rated for. What happens when you push past that rating for long enough. Materials don't always fail dramatically. Sometimes they just slowly deform, bearing more than they were designed for, until one day you do a proper assessment and realize the whole thing has been compromised for years. You fix it or you condemn it. Those are the options. I spent 23 years carrying a load I wasn't designed to carry, and one Sunday morning in August, standing in a cottage kitchen on Lake of Bays with a spatula in my hand, I put it down. I'm in Port Credit now. The view from my place in the morning, when the lake is flat, is something I'll never take for granted. I run my firm. We're at 19 employees now. We just finished a community recreation center in Brampton that I'm proud of in a way I find hard to describe. Not because it's technically impressive, though it is, but because every person who walks into that building for the next 50 years will never know my name, and it doesn't matter at all. Patrick comes for dinner on Sundays sometimes. He brings his girlfriend, we cook and talk, and nobody manages the room. Last fall, I was up in Muskoka for a job, an assessment on a small commercial property near Gravenhurst. I drove past the turnoff for Lake of Bays on the way back. Just a green highway sign. I looked at it. Then I kept driving. That's it. That's all there is. No dramatic confrontation. No moment where I said the perfect thing and watched someone's face change. Just a man who finally stopped waiting for permission to walk out of a room that was never going to get warmer. The silence on that drive home was the loudest thing I'd heard in 23 years.